In the summer of 1918, a young man sat down at an examination table in Japan and was handed a test that was supposed to determine the rest of his life. His father, a tax administrator named Yoshimi, had one clear ambition for his second son, medicine, a respectable career, a stable income, the kind of future that didn't require explanation at a dinner table. The young man picked up his pen. He wrote his name at the top of the page, and then he put the pen down and handed in every sheet completely blank. His name was Chiune Sugihara. He was 18 years old, and that quiet, deliberate act of defiance, not dramatic, not violent, just a refusal, would turn out to be the most consistent thing about him for the rest of his life. Sugihara was born on the first day of the 20th century. January 1, 1900, in the small city of Kuzuchi, in Gifu Prefecture, central Japan. His mother's family carried samurai lineage. His father worked for the government. By Japanese middle-class standards of the era, he was expected to be useful, obedient, and ambitious in the approved direction. He was ambitious, just not in the approved direction. After the blank exam papers episode, which ended his relationship with his father for a time, Sugihara enrolled at Waseda University in Tokyo, paying his own way with part-time jobs, studying English literature. The following year, 1919, he passed the Foreign Ministry scholarship exams and was sent abroad to study. Not to Europe, but to Harbin, in Manchuria, in what is now northeastern China. Harbin was one of the more unusual cities in the world at the time. It had been built largely by Russian engineers overseeing the construction of the Chinese Eastern Railway, and by the 1920s it was a cosmopolitan jumble of Japanese, Chinese, and Russian populations, with a substantial Jewish community that had fled the Bolshevik Revolution. Sugihara spent 16 years there. He became fluent enough in Russian to be considered one of the finest Russian language specialists in the entire Japanese diplomatic corps. He converted to Russian Orthodox Christianity, taking the baptismal name Sergei Pavlovich. He married a Russian woman named Claudia Apollonova, and he absorbed a way of thinking about people that didn't fit neatly into the imperial nationalism that was tightening its grip on Japan back home. The marriage to Claudia ended in divorce in 1935, but the Harbin years had done something to Sugihara that couldn't be undone. By the early 1930s, he had risen to a position of real influence. After Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931 and established the puppet state of Manchukuo, Sugihara was appointed Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs for that territory, a significant post for a man still in his early 30s. His most notable achievement in that role was negotiating the purchase of the North Manchurian Railway from the Soviet Union. He'd done his homework, determined the actual market value of the line, and secured it for a fraction of what Moscow had initially demanded. It was a considerable diplomatic coup, and it should have set him up for a long and distinguished career. He resigned instead. What he'd witnessed in Manchuria was the systematic brutality of the Japanese Kuomintang army against the Chinese civilian population. He'd watched it up close and apparently found it intolerable. In 1934, he submitted his resignation from the Manchukuo Foreign Ministry, returned to Japan, and told his superiors that his conscience would not allow him to continue. This is the detail that tends to get left out of the Sugihara story when it circulates online. He had already, years before the war, years before Kaunas, demonstrated a specific kind of moral courage, the willingness to sacrifice professional advancement rather than become complicit in something he believed was wrong. The resignation was noted. It wasn't forgotten by the people who held his career in their hands. Back in Tokyo, Sugihara married Yukiko Kikuchi in 1936. They would have 4 sons together. In 1937, the Foreign Ministry, which still valued his Russian expertise despite everything, posted him to Helsinki as a translator. 2 years later, in August 1939, he received a new assignment: vice consul at a brand new Japanese consulate in Kaunas, Lithuania. Lithuania was a small Baltic republic wedged between Germany to the west, Poland to the south, and the Soviet Union to the east. Kaunas served as the country's provisional capital. It was not a prestigious posting. The consulate operated from a rented building on Vesganto Street, and Sugihara was essentially a one-man operation, living upstairs with Yukiko and their children. But the posting wasn't random, and it wasn't modest. The Japanese Foreign Ministry needed someone who could monitor military movements on the eastern frontier, specifically whether Germany was showing any signs of turning on its Soviet partner. If the German army moved east, Soviet forces would be pulled toward Europe, relieving pressure on Japan's own military operations in Asia. Sugihara's job, in practical terms, was intelligence gathering. He watched, listened, and reported. He arrived in Kaunas in late August 1939. Within days, the world around him collapsed. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland from the west. On September 17, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. Poland ceased to exist as an independent state in a matter of weeks. The immediate consequence was a flood of refugees, tens of thousands of Polish civilians, and among them a large proportion of Polish Jews who were already experiencing the first waves of Nazi persecution, fled eastward into Lithuania. Estimates suggest around 15,000 Jewish refugees managed to cross into the country. Lithuania in this period still had a Jewish community of over 250,000 people, one of the largest and most culturally vibrant in Europe. The newcomers were sheltered, fed, and initially given some hope of stability. It was a fragile hope. In June 1940, the Soviet Union annexed Lithuania. By August, it had been formally absorbed into the USSR as the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic. The NKVD moved in. Arrests began. Deportations to Siberia followed. Nationalist leaders, religious figures, members of Zionist organizations, anyone the Soviets considered a political threat, disappeared into the machinery of Soviet repression. For the Jewish refugees who had already fled Nazi Germany and Nazi-occupied Poland, the situation was now existentially desperate. West and south were closed, occupied Europe. North was the Baltic Sea. East was the Soviet Union itself. There was, in theory, one possible escape route: travel east across the entirety of the USSR on the Trans-Siberian Railway, reach Vladivostok on the Pacific Coast board, a ship to Japan, and from Japan attempt to reach a third country willing to grant asylum: the United States, Canada, Australia, or the British Mandate of Palestine. The problem was bureaucratic, and it was lethal. Soviet authorities would only issue transit permits to refugees who could prove they had a valid destination visa for a third country. Without that proof, the Soviets wouldn't let them through. And without Soviet transit permission, the entire route was impossible. This is where a Dutch consular official named Jan Zwartendijk enters the story, a man who deserves rather more attention than he usually gets. Zwartendijk was serving as the honorary Dutch consul in Kaunas. He discovered that the Dutch colonies of Curaçao and Suriname in the Caribbean did not technically require an entry visa. They required only the approval of the local colonial governor upon arrival. But there was no legal requirement for a stamp or visa in advance. Acting on his own initiative, Zwartendijk began writing a simple note into refugees' passports: no visa required for Curaçao. It was legally accurate, if somewhat incomplete, in its implications. And once the refugees had that notation, they had the nominal destination they needed to approach the Soviets for a transit permit. But the Soviets also required a transit visa for Japan, the country the refugees would pass through between the USSR and the ship to Curaçao. And the only person in Kaunas who could issue a Japanese transit visa was Chiune Sugihara. In late July 1940, a crowd began gathering outside the consulate on Vesganto Street. Sugihara and his wife Yukiko could see them from the windows. Hundreds of people, men, women, children, standing in the street with documents in their hands, waiting. Many of them had been standing there since before dawn. What happened next is reasonably well documented. Sugihara sent 3 separate telegrams to the Foreign Ministry in Tokyo requesting emergency authorization to issue transit visas under relaxed conditions, specifically to applicants who did not meet the standard requirements for financial means or confirmed onward travel. Tokyo's responses were consistent. The answer was no. 3 times, no. The standard criteria applied. The visas could not be issued to people who didn't qualify. The instructions were clear. Sugihara discussed the situation with Yukiko. By her account, and by his own later, the decision wasn't agonized over for weeks. He told her he intended to begin issuing visas regardless of Tokyo's instructions. She supported him. If there were consequences, they would face them together. On the morning of July 31st, 1940, by most accounts, he opened the consulate and began writing. Here it's worth being precise about the numbers, because this is exactly where the myth diverges most sharply from the history. The version that circulates online, 30,000 visas in 3 days until his hands were paralyzed, does not correspond to any documented evidence. It appears in no serious archival source. It is not supported by records held by the Japanese Foreign Ministry, by Yad Vashem, or by any reputable Holocaust research institution. What the documents actually show is this: Sugihara issued approximately 2,039 transit visas during the period the consulate was operational in Kaunas. Many of these visas covered entire family units. A single document could account for a husband, wife, and several children. When researchers account for that multiplier, the estimated number of individuals who directly benefited from those visas is approximately 6,000 people. Some analyses, incorporating different series of archival documents and including visas issued after the consulate formally closed, produce estimates closer to 5,580 individual visas, still translating to roughly 6,000 beneficiaries when family units are considered. Some sources cite figures as high as 10,000, but these are not the consensus of academic scholarship. 6,000 people is not a smaller number than 30,000. In the context of what was about to happen to European Jewry, 6,000 lives is an almost incomprehensible act of rescue. But the timeline matters too. Sugihara didn't write visas for 3 days. He wrote them for weeks, from late July through the last days of August 1940, when Soviet authorities ordered all remaining foreign consulates to close immediately and leave the country. The work was physically grueling. Standard consular practice allowed for perhaps 1 or 2 visas per hour, with careful documentation of each applicant's information. Sugihara abandoned the standard documentation procedures. He simplified the forms, worked from early morning until late at night, accounts speak of 18-hour days, and kept writing. His hand ached, his wrist cramped. Yukiko would sometimes massage his arm so he could continue. The image of hands that hurt, hands that seized up with exhaustion, that part is real. It comes from survivor testimony and from Yukiko's own memoirs. It became hands paralyzed in 3 days, somewhere along the way, passed from account to account until it hardened into fact. It isn't fact. It's the residue of something that was genuinely true, worn smooth by repetition. The Soviets gave the consulate a closing date. The date came. Sugihara packed up the official records, handed over the consulate's affairs, and moved with his family to a hotel while they awaited their travel documents to leave Lithuania. He kept writing visas from the hotel room. On the day his train departed Kaunas, witnesses described him standing at the window of his railway compartment, still filling out documents, passing them to people on the platform through the open window. The train began to move. He reportedly bowed from the window, apologizing to the people left behind, still reaching. There are testimonies, most famously from a survivor named Soli Ganner, who had met Sugihara and his wife at a Hanukkah celebration the previous winter, describing this scene on the platform. The train pulled away. The consulate was closed. The route east remained open for a while longer. Most of those who received visas from Sugihara and Zwartendijk did make it out. They crossed Soviet territory on the Trans-Siberian Railway, a journey of several thousand miles, arrived in Vladivostok, and took ships to the Japanese port of Suruga. From Japan, they dispersed to Shanghai, to the United States, to Canada, to Palestine. The Curaçao Gambit, in the end, was almost never actually used. Most recipients used Japan as a genuine transit stop and found other destinations. But the piece of paper worked. It got them on the train. Sugihara returned to Japan after the war. He was called into the foreign ministry in 1947 and, by his own account, asked to resign. He understood it as punishment for the unauthorized visa issuance. Whether Tokyo framed it exactly that way is not entirely clear from surviving documents. The ministry's own records on the matter are sparse, but Sugihara consistently interpreted the forced resignation as the price he paid for Kaunas. He spent the following decades in relative obscurity, working for private companies, including a trading firm in Moscow in the 1960s and 70s. He rarely spoke of what he had done. His children were mostly unaware of the details. In Japan, he was unknown. The story began to surface in the early 1960s through survivors and their descendants who had spent years trying to locate the man who had signed their documents. Many of them remembered the name on the visa, Senpo Sugihara, a Japanese reading of the characters in his given name that he had sometimes used professionally and which appeared on the official stamps. In 1968, a survivor named Yehoshua Nishri, who had become an official at the Israeli embassy in Tokyo, located Sugihara after years of searching. The reunion was, by all accounts, bewildering for Sugihara, not because he regretted what he had done, but because he had apparently never expected to be found, or thanked, or remembered. In 1985, Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial and Research Authority in Jerusalem, designated Chiune Sugihara as righteous among the nations. It is the highest honor Israel bestows on non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. He was one of only a handful of Japanese nationals ever to receive it. He died on July 31, 1986. His wife Yukiko lived until 2008. Today, estimates suggest that the descendants of the roughly 6,000 people who escaped through Sugihara's visas number in the tens of thousands. Some accounts say as many as 40,000 living people owe their existence in some direct line to those documents written in a rented building on Visconto Street in the summer of 1940. That number is already extraordinary. It doesn't need inflation. The 30,000 visas in 3 days version doesn't make the story more impressive. It makes it less true. And the truth, as it usually turns out, is more interesting than the legend. What makes Sugihara's actions remarkable isn't speed or volume. It's duration. It's the choice, made fresh every morning for weeks, to sit back down at the desk and keep writing. It's the knowledge, and he absolutely knew, that each document he signed was a direct act of insubordination that would be waiting for him when he got home. He didn't do this in a crisis moment that swept him up and carried him along. He did it deliberately, repeatedly, day after day, against explicit orders from his own government, in full awareness of the professional cost. He had practice at that, of course. He'd been doing it since he was 18 years old, sitting at an exam table with a pen in his hand and a blank page in front of him.